Hello, everyone. Welcome to our AI Governance Live Talk. Today I'm here with Gary Marcus. Hello, Gary. Welcome to the show.
Hey, I'm excited to be here.
So, today we are talking about Taming Silicon Valley and governing AI. Gary has his book, so you can show the audience. Gary, you have the book.
Oh, I
If
didn't
you
know I was going
haven't,
to do the Vanna White thing. Look at this lovely paperback, released in paperback to be inexpensive and accessible to all.
you see, if you haven't bought yet, you can go. So it's paperback and hardcover, and it's everywhere.
Only
How
paperback, only
only paperback?
paperback, only inexpensive.
And where can online every online store that people can find it or anywhere specific?
The- Theoretically, yes.
Okay.
Shouldn't be too hard to find.
And today we are talking about AI policy, AI regulation, all the hot stuff in AI. If you follow Gary on Twitter and now on Blue Sky, also where else on LinkedIn, you know that Gary has spicy opinions on AI and on Silicon Valley, on AI regulation and all those topics we are covering today. So I'm excited to be here with Gary, and I'm happy that the audience is already so active. So before we start, I want to remind you, so if you're not a subscriber yet, so subscribe to my newsletter, luizasnewsletter.com, to stay up to date with everything related to AI governance, AI policy, AI regulation, the latest lawsuits, AI copyright lawsuits, and so on. Gary also has a newsletter, right? It's garymarcus.substack.com.
Yeah, that's
So
right.
you can also subscribe. You should subscribe to Gary newsletter. If you want to join the AI governance training, December edition, so register soon. So it's starting in the first week of December. So don't miss it. The website you can join using the website under my name. So before every time I have when I have guests in these live talks, I like to hear a bit about your personal story, Gary. So I was checking your LinkedIn, your background. So you have a PhD in cognitive science from the MIT, right, from a few years ago. And your background is cognitive science, and today you're still a professor of psychology and neuroscience at NYU. So I
Well,
wanted
I'm
to hear a little bit.
retired professor. I'm professor
You're not
emeritus, which is like an honorable discharge. I retired at the age of 49. And another trivia fact is that I never finished high school. So I've been a rebel since I dropped out of high school and went straight to college. So
that part I didn't know. So I want to hear. So how was that story from high school rebel to cognitive science to AI? What made you attract? What made you move to this field of AI? And now you're so also focused on AI policy, AI regulation. So what did you find interesting in AI?
well, first of all, the order is backwards. So I was interested in coding from the time that I touched a paper computer when I was 8 years old, which was also my first experience explaining computers to other people on the local television channel when I was 8. That immediately got me into AI, and AI got me into cognitive science because I thought, well, these AI systems aren't very good. How do people do these things? So I was into cognitive science by the time I was 15. And in fact, part of the reason that I dropped out of high school was so that I could pursue cognitive science in college. There was no way to do it in high school. I was already working on AI then. I wrote a Latin to English translator in the computer programming language Logo, which is a little bit like Lisp. And so I was interested in AI for a long time, but also kind of disappointed with it. And that did lead me to a long career that was always kind of straddling the two, primarily in the cognitive sciences, looking at child development, cognitive development, but also always looking at neural networks. So my dissertation was actually comparing human children and how they learn language with artificial neural networks that are kind of the ancestors to today's large language models, and showing some important differences between them. So I've been interested in AI for a really long time, and I think my role in AI has really been to look at what's going on and take a cognitive science perspective and say, how does this compare with what humans are doing? That always made me hated because I always said that what we've got is not really good enough, and nobody wants to hear that their pride and joy isn't good enough. But the reality is, I think it's not. And we might talk about this long arc about diminishing returns. I've been calling that for a long time, much to the consternation of the field. But I think in the last few weeks, that's actually become a common view. So Mark Andreessen, for example, and Ilya Sutskever have acknowledged that we probably are actually hitting a wall with large language models. So anyway, that's one strand of what I've done throughout my career. The other strand is policy. That's much newer. I've always been, like, I guess I'd say politically interested, but I didn't really work on policy until I thought that people kind of lost their bearings around ChatGPT. So I was always interested in some of these issues and so forth. But when ChatGPT came out, I feel like the field of AI went from a research field, a research driven field primarily, people just trying to do the best they could in AI, to something that was very clearly shaped by money and priorities of money. And the notion of responsible AI just like disappeared overnight. It went from like a valued thing to like an afterthought. I think a lot of companies back down on their promises around responsible AI. And at the same time, because generative AI is unreliable for technical reasons, which related to kind of my life's research around generalization and so forth, because they were inadequate for technical reasons, that opened up some problems. And because suddenly they were in widespread distribution, 100 million people overnight started using ChatGPT, we suddenly were in this kind of perfect storm of corporate irresponsibility, unreliable technology, but distributed at large scale. And that really concerned me. And so I've spent a lot of the last 2 years working on policy, trying to explain to people why large language models and the kind of ecosphere around it are morally and technically inadequate, and trying to think about what we might do about it.
And taking from that, so you mentioned in your book, so how Silicon Valley always tries to downplay risks, right? So you mentioned now briefly, so people don't want to talk about it, but also because there's money involved. So of course the CEOs, they don't want to say that it's not good enough. So hype sells more. When it's excellent, it's going to increase productivity, it's going to shape the industry and so on. So I took some quotes from your book. So you mentioned, for example, when Yann LeCun, so Yann LeCun is Meta's chief scientist, for those in the audience that don't know. So he claimed in a series of tweets on Twitter in November and December 2022 that there is no real risk, reasoning fallaciously that what hadn't happened yet would not happen ever. So LLM have been widely available for 4 years, and no one can exhibit victims of their hypothesized dangerousness. So this is by Yann LeCun. And you also cited...
Certainly not by me.
Hmm?
I said, certainly not by me. Exactly. I mean, Yann LeCun said that.
Yann LeCun. Yeah, exactly. So Yann LeCun. And in May 2023, so Microsoft's chief economist, Michael Schwartz, told an audience at the World Economic Forum that we should hold off on regulation until serious harm had occurred. There has to be at least a bit of harm so that we see what the real problem is. Is there a real problem? Did anybody suffer at least $1,000 worth of damage because of that? Should we jump into to regulate something on a planet of 8 billion people when there's not even $1,000 of damage? Of course not. So these were Yann LeCun and Michael Schwartz, so not Gary. So this whole idea of downplaying risks. And of course, now we are November 2024. So we had robocalls, we have deaths. So there was the Belgian man that suicided himself last year. So this year we had the Florida teenager that suicided because of an AI chatbot. We have ubiquitous hallucinations. So the hallucinations problem has not been solved, and there has been, from a privacy perspective, reputational harm, misinformation, non-consensual pornography, and we will soon switch to your list of the most dangerous parts of generative AI. So I think you get Silicon Valley much better than I. So why do they keep doing it? They keep denying or downplaying it. What's behind it? So there's something I don't. As I'm a lawyer, so from a legal perspective, I see that as liability as bad, so they should not be. They should be realistic. They should know that they will be held responsible. So why do you first question? Why do you think they keep doing that? Still denying, downplaying risks. So it's all good. It's shaping and kind of not talking seriously about what's going wrong.
Well, I think one of your premises isn't quite right, or at least they're not sure that it's right, which is that they will be held responsible. I think, in fact, that they've been held responsible for very little. The law may not hold them responsible. One of the worst, well, no, let me start that sentence again. In the technology sphere, one of the worst laws in the United States is Section 230, which gives a lot of protection, at least to the social media platforms. And it remains to be seen how much protection that gives to AI companies. A bunch of people think that it shouldn't protect AI companies, but we don't know. So Section 230 is, for those in the audience who don't know it, is a law that basically says social media can post anything they want and not be held responsible for it. So it's a very large shield against liability in the United States. Now, it was written in simpler days. It was written when all you had were things like CompuServe, which were bulletin boards. People would just post things, and the companies, the media platforms, if you even wanted to call them that, weren't ranking things or anything like that. You just had a list of messages in order. It's very primitive stuff. And at that point, they were given this protection from liability. Then when Facebook invented newsfeed, or roughly around then, the social media companies started prioritizing what you see, and still got that protection, but it changed the game. So when they would prioritize things, what they did deliberately was to prioritize the things that got the most engagement, because more engagement means you're on the platform more, they can sell more advertisements and so forth. And that might not sound awful, but what it turns out that it does is it actually prioritizes misinformation, because misinformation outrages people, and outrage actually drives engagement. And so what happened is you suddenly had social media companies that were distributing lots and lots of misinformation, and Section 230 did not hold them liable for that. Section 230 gave them kind of a free pass on that. When I spoke at the Senate, you may recall that I did that last year next to Sam Altman. There was bipartisan support to change Section 230 such that it did not apply to AI. But that hasn't actually happened. After I testified in the Senate, Mark Zuckerberg came. You probably saw at least a clip of him turning around and apologizing to the parents of kids. At that trial, there was again, not trial here, at that hearing, there was again bipartisan support for changing Section 230 in certain ways so that it wouldn't give the technology companies so much liability. And nothing has happened. And we can talk about like why Washington has had to been ineffective. It's probably not going to do anything in the new administration, but who knows? We can talk about that too if you want. But so I would start there. I would then talk about SB 1047, which was a California law that was proposed that would give the companies liability, at least for catastrophic harm, which was defined as $500 million, or there's some equation, I don't know what the variables, to convert that into a certain number of lives lost. And even that, the tech lobbyists like Mark Andreessen and so forth, venture capitalists, were able to shoot down. They were able to, I think, to intimidate. And we don't know the causal mechanism, but they protested very loudly. And we know that Gavin Newsom, the governor, didn't sign that bill. And so, fear of liability, that's one side of my answer. I'm going to give two sides. One side is that liability laws in the United States, and obviously they're different in the EU, are not at all clear. And so the companies are like, we'll do this and we can fight out in the courts. So you probably saw, and maybe many of your listeners saw, this famous quote from Eric Schmidt. He was talking to a classroom earlier this summer. I guess it was probably off the record, but it got reported anyway. He said, if you could take over, if TikTok got kicked out of the U.S., I don't remember the exact words, you should all try to basically take their business. And the famous phrase was something like, and let the lawyers sort it out later. And that is the message to Silicon Valley. Let the lawyers sort it out. So, try to capture as much of the business, whether that business be social media or AI or whatever, and worry about liability later. Let the lawyers sort that out. And of course, given how financially well off a lot of these companies are, they have an expectation that they'll probably get what they want. And it's not really just the lawyers, it's also the lobbyists. So the lobbying apparatus of Silicon Valley is extremely well organized, extremely well funded. I think most people have no idea how active and powerful it is. And so that's another reason why I think they don't care. And then there's a third reason, which is the media very rarely holds the big tech companies responsible for very much of anything. A little bit around social media. It took them years to catch up on that. It's going to take them years to catch up on AI. I'll just give a slightly different example of that, which is people like Elon Musk, and not just Elon Musk, have learned that you can make promises that aren't delivered. So, for example, Musk had a product called Autopilot, which sounds to the average person like something will drive your car for you, but it doesn't actually do that. There is, I think, one lawsuit pending about that. It's kind of false advertising, but he's never been held to account. Then he offered a product called full self-driving, which sounds like the car should do full self-driving. It doesn't. He also promised, for example, there would be a million robo-taxis on the road by 2020. Never happened. He's never held to account for any of this. It just drives his stock market up. So Sam Altman took a hint from that, and now he's talking about how like AI is going to solve physics, which I don't even know if that's a coherent concept, but it sounds good, and it drives up the valuations of his companies. Never held responsible. Elizabeth Holmes was held responsible for Theranos, but that is very rare. In general, Silicon Valley feels free to say whatever it wants and knows that in the worst case, the lawyers will sort it out. It's just the cost of doing business. So they're not real worried about liability and so forth.
So it's nice that you bring this Washington perspective. So let's me bring a Brussels perspective. So as you might, I posted on that. So this week, the new product liability directive entered into force. So it was published in the official journal. So it's going to enter into force in 20 days. And it says that it's applicable to AI. It expressly mentions AI. This we are talking now about Europe. So what might happen in Europe, just to bring a different side of this debate. And maybe that's why they're stressed out. We know that Meta, Spotify, and other companies, they have recently signed this letter. So Europe is over-regulating, so we don't like that. So let's bring this, you brought liability, so let's bring a little bit of that. So this new product liability directive, it says that it is applicable to AI as well. So it's not focused on AI, it's focused on software. So it was amended to also cover software, but it mentions that it covers AI. And at some point, it also mentions that in the black box argument, right? So it's difficult to explain sometimes. It will be difficult to say that it was because of that algorithm, because of that AI system. So they said if it's too difficult, if the burden is too high for the victim to prove, then there can be presumption of culpability. So this is very strong, this type of, we call it in law, strict liability. So this is big. This is actually, so I wrote about it in my newsletter this week. I'm going to write again tomorrow. I think so. You brought a Washington perspective, but I think Europe, things are changing, especially. So we have the AI Act. I have my own criticism about the AI Act, and we have product liability,
which I would like to ask you about later in the interview, by the way.
We'll talk about when we mention the Brussels effect. I'll talk more about that. So we have the AI Act, we have product liability directive, and we soon have AI liability directive that some experts now are pushing for AI liability regulation, which will be stronger, will be directly applicable to all member states. So I think things are changing, at least in Europe, and we can criticize that. Some people are saying that it's not good for the startups, so they're well behind in competition. So at least, so I will rephrase my initial point that, well, from an European perspective, at least from countries that are paying attention to regulation and liability and trying to put things under control, what they're saying, what they keep saying, is going to be bad for them. I'd say at short run, long run, it's bad. So maybe just to bring a different position.
I mean, I don't doubt that the companies are saying that, and of course, they were threatening California and saying, we will leave if you pass this. But I think that was bogus. They wouldn't have actually left. No, not one company would have left California if 1047 had passed. They would have just seen it as, okay, we have to do some more compliance. I mean, maybe a startup would have left, but none of these big, well-funded startups, none of the publicly traded companies and so forth would have left California.
And you think they're threatening to leave Europe? Do you think it's just a threat, or they're going to leave Europe?
I think it's probably an empty threat. I mean, don't forget that Altman already threatened to leave Europe once over, I guess it was Italian restrictions on ChatGPT, and he didn't actually leave. I would be very surprised. It's a big market. I mean, related to that and related to the Brussels effect, which is, I guess you want to talk about more later. But what I think is going to happen here is that Europe's going to set the rules, because the U.S. is moving the opposite direction. Like, I don't know if people are following Elon Musk and Vivek Ramos. I may mispronounce his last names. Doge thing, but what it really is not about saving money, or at least that's not the main purpose. I think the real purpose is to undermine regulatory bodies. And there's a decision called the Chevron decision that the Supreme Court just made not that long ago that they've already pointed to as a tool in that quest. So their goal is going to be to try to undermine every regulatory body. I mean, in part because, like, Musk has companies, he doesn't really want them to be regulated. And so Europe is going to have strong regulation around AI, and the US is likely to have almost none. And I think the long-term question is going to be, does that matter for the US? The companies are going to be obliged to do a bunch of stuff for Europe. And the US citizens are kind of like sitting ducks. And one of the things that they want this to do, want this to work around, people like Musk, is clearly misinformation. He loves spreading misinformation. He doesn't want any responsibility for misinformation. And in fact, he wants to threaten Europe. It's pretty clear, with the dissolving, the dissolution or weakening of NATO. And that's partly for him, although maybe not for other people, about not wanting to comply with rules around misinformation. Musk sees, I think, that the way for him to run the world is through misinformation. So he's very attached to having the legal right to do that. He gets upset when Democrats spread misinformation, but he loves spreading misinformation for Republicans. You can see it literally every day in his Twitter feed. Um, and so we're going to be in this situation where the only real regulation is the EU. A lot of people will want to follow the EU standard. Other countries will, and so that's actually giving EU an interesting source of power because the US is abdicating its role. You would have expected that the US would have looked at the EU AI Act and said, "Okay, that's good, but we can do better." I mean, that's what I had hoped the US would do. And in fact, I said that in the Senate. I said we should take the leadership here and not let the EU run it all. And the senators nodded and they kind of, they seemed to agree. But the reality is that the US is not going to take any leadership role in AI regulation at all. And so the EU is going to be leading that way by default. Now, I understand that it's not perfect and you've got a critique of it, and I'm not as up on you about it. And probably it is weaker than it should be. And people, the big companies will figure out all the loopholes and so forth. But we are in a place where I think the US is just entirely abdicating on this.
So just for the audience to know, I wanted to ask Gary about the Brussels effect. So the Brussels effect is this expression. It was coined by Andrew Bradford. That refers to the fact that Europe is leading in regulation. So it happened with the GDPR, so General Data Protection Regulation. So when Europe enacted the GDPR, the Brussels effect happened. So many countries, and as a Brazilian, I know Brazil was one of them. So many countries borrowed some of the concepts and ideas and principles, and the idea that data protection, privacy is a fundamental right. So protecting human dignity and so forth. So it happened with data protection. And I've been asking my guests in recent editions if they think the Brussels effect will happen with AI, and the majority of them have said no, it's not going to happen because the AI is different from privacy, because privacy is a right, protecting data. So data protection, it's a law about protecting rights or protecting data. And when we talk about AI, is this big thing that everybody's is thinking that is the future, is going to drive the economy, so bring major profits, and no country wants to, and also related to national defense. So nobody wants to be tied on that. They want to do whatever is possible to compete against China and other adversaries. So I would say, so what is your?
It's too broad an argument. Part of it is correct and part of it's not. So it is true that no defense department is going to be constrained at all, right? I mean, the only way you get any constraint there is the way that we did with certain kinds of chemical weapons where there's a kind of social stigma. And we could wind up with a social stigma around using AI-powered drones. But I think that the generals in every country want to use them so badly that that's not too likely to happen. It could happen, for example, if there's enough targeted assassinations with drones, and maybe people's public opinion will change. But short of that, I think it'd be pretty hard to constrain the generals. But that doesn't mean that on some of the other aspects of AI regulation that there's not going to be any desire by countries to do things. I mean, in fact, all the time I hear, well, the US can't regulate AI because China won't. And China actually has regulated AI more than the US, I mean, substantially more than the US. In some ways I don't like, in most ways that I think are pretty reasonable. And so it's just a red herring. And so like China, I think, will do their own thing. People will either take the China model or the European model. There won't be a US model. And people are going to see that democracy is falling apart in the United States. And if they care about that, then they're not going to want to follow that part of the model. They're going to see that cybercrime is going to go way up in the US, and they're probably not going to want that, and so forth. And so I think a lot of countries will want to regulate AI. And either they'll go with the Chinese model, which they will do in certain parts of the world, especially as I think what's going to happen in the Trump administration is the US is going to kind of withdraw, have these high tariffs and so forth, discouraging other countries from being a trade partner with the US. And so that's going to push more countries towards China. And so some people will adopt China's, ideas around AI regulation, most of which, not all of which, again, are reasonable. And then others will choose to follow the European model. Nobody's going to follow the US model. There isn't one.
So they regulate. So just to go back to the AI Act and what we so national defense, it's not so the AI Act doesn't apply, so it doesn't even matter. So it's also an exception for the AI Act. But when we think about, for example, general purpose, so AGI, so this big hype word, or that in the AI Act, we have general purpose AI models and general purpose AI models with systemic risk. So we have the articles covering each one. So if you're classified as having system, even if you are, for example, open source, which is something I think Meta is upset about. So even if you are open source, but you are considered as having systemic risk, you're going to have to comply with some of the transparency obligations and other obligations in the AI Act. So that part, I would say most countries, they are refraining from, especially because general purpose AI models are currently associated with, wow, big disruptions. Maybe AGI, maybe something very big will happen. So if I regulate that too much,
current general purpose models have, of course, nothing to do with AI. That's just hype. But we can talk about that separately if you want. I think a lot of people labor under the belief that GPT-5 or something like that is going to be AGI, but I think that that's an absurd view. It is, in fact, shaping a lot of world policy. Like the U.S. is putting a lot of money into AI because they seem to think that we're not very far from AGI and that it's important to be first to have AGI. My view is a really bad bet. Maybe I'll just say a little bit about the diminishing return stuff. I have long argued that it is inherent in how large language models work that they will hallucinate, make boneheaded errors, and so forth. I actually anticipated hallucinations in 2001 in a book called The Algebraic Mind. These problems have been around for really a long time. And they follow because all these systems are doing is statistically accumulating models of how people talk, but not how people actually think. And they're just not going to get better in this regard. And so I've been saying we would reach a period of diminishing returns. And now I think we have, in fact, reached that period of diminishing returns. If we are, then we're certainly not getting to AGI.
I see.
So,
No,
I mean,
from a regulatory perspective, I would say from lawyers, talking from the side of the lawyers. So as lawyers, we don't learn about technical stuff. And we hear that people are saying things that might happen, disruptions, technological disruptions that might get out of control. So when we look at the classification as having systemic risk in the AI Act, that's what more or less they have in mind. So they have some, for example, the number of parameters, computation power.
Can I interrupt for 1 second? You can have systemic risk without AGI. I just want to clarify a couple things. So AGI will come someday. Maybe it will be in 20 years. It's not going to be in 2 years. That's absurd. But it could come in 20 years. But we have systemic risk now. So we have systemic risks around discrimination. We have systemic risks around disinformation, et cetera, that are here right now. So and this also goes back to something you said earlier that I wanted to clarify. The one risk that the big companies want to talk about is that robots will take over the world. And I think that's because it makes the AI sound like so cool and so powerful. And so it's part of the hype apparatus. And B, nobody has any idea what to do about it. So there are no concrete steps that they have to take. And it's, abstract enough they don't feel super responsible to it. Whereas all of these near-term risks, they also have nothing really substantive to do around them, but they're here right now and they don't want to be held responsible for them. So it's almost like a rhetorical move that they will acknowledge that something really bad, like the annihilation of the species, could happen. I think it's very unlikely, but the a bunch of CEOs have said, yeah, this stuff could annihilate the species. That is in large part like theater to distract from these other systemic risks that can happen right now, even if we don't have AGI. So back to your question, but I just want to clarify all that.
No, great that we are going to the next topic is the 12 biggest immediate threats from generative AI. Let's switch to that now. So in Gary's book, he talks about the 12 biggest immediate threats to generative AI. And I'm going to build soon a bridge with the AI Act and how it's regulated and how I think at least the lawmakers are thinking and lawmakers from different countries are thinking. So I just, for the audience to know what Gary mentions in his book. So this is the list. So the first one, deliberate, automate, mass-produce political disinformation. 2, market manipulation. 3, accidental misinformation. 4, defamation. 5, non-consensual deepfakes. 6, accelerating crime. 7, cybersecurity and bioweapons. 8, bias and discrimination. 9, privacy and data leaks. 10, intellectual property taking without consent. 11, over-reliance or unreliable systems, and 12, environmental costs. So these are the what Gary raises as the 12 threats and biggest threats. We are going to talk soon about what we should be insisting on. So the positive side. So now we are talking about the bad side. And my question on that. So again, going back to regulation. So do you think having those threats? So some of them, as I'm very familiar with the AI Act, so I know that some of those are not going to be solved by law itself. So for one of them, hallucinations, right? So accidental misinformation, law cannot really solve that. For example, some of other of here law might.
Wait a second. Wait a second. Just for the sake of interesting argument here, if the penalties were severe enough, then the companies would be incented to build better technologies, or we could refuse market access. If you couldn't meet some standard, we could say you couldn't do that. You couldn't put this in market. We do that for drugs, for cars, for airplanes, and so forth. We're giving a free pass to large language models because of a perception that they're going to make a lot of money.
But you mean holding companies responsible for the solution? The legal solution would be holding companies liable for the output of a large language model. For example, if there is, let's say,
I think there's two different avenues you could pursue. Okay. One would be economic fines, penalties, etc., for accidental defamation, for example. Have some legal penalty if you spread enough misinformation of certain sorts. So, in the U.S., the First Amendment pretty much protects things unless they're, sufficiently bad in certain kinds of ways. But we could say if you do this at large scale, that's different from an individual. We could have, we could treat the commercial production of misinformation, accidental misinformation of certain sorts as a punishable thing. So one thing is we could charge you per incident. Could be a small amount of money, but you do enough of it and it adds up. So that's one side of it. And the other is we could just deny market access. So we do that with drugs. Like if you don't show that the benefit of your new pharmaceutical is greater than the cost, then you go back to the drawing board. It doesn't mean you could never produce this drug, but maybe you have to supplement it in some way, or maybe you have to think of a different drug. And so it's really important to remember that the large language models are just one possible approach in an enormous space of possible AI techniques. Many AI techniques don't suffer any of the 12 things that I'm talking about, or maybe one or two at most. So like the GPS navigation stuff that plans your routes doesn't have all of these problems. It's a kind of AI that is basically without serious harms as long as it's competently implemented. It so happens that the most popular AI that we have right now is the riskiest and most dangerous. And we could, as a society, say, come back to us when you stop having these problems, when you don't need to use the amount of energy to power New Jersey to train one model that you might not even release. Come back to us, or whatever. We could set various standards. And we choose not to.
From a legal perspective, at least an European perspective, there is always this argument of it's not feasible now, so I'm not going to do it. So if it's not feasible, I do my best. So that's something that comes again and again in the AI Act.
For example, not feasible to meet such and such standard, you mean?
So, for example, I cannot meet the standard of zero hallucinations. So that's it. You want large.
I mean, you could have a negotiation too. You could, show. I mean, first of all, we don't have good metrics around that. But let's say we did. We could say, look, fine, 1%. But tell us why the benefit of this makes it worth the cost of 1% error. In fact, it's probably more like 25% or something like that. But sure, we could do that. I'd be very happy to see some set of standards around performance. The fact is we have none, and that we have decided as a society, as a globe, that we are so lustful for this technology that we have basically no standards around it, which is different from almost everything else in the planet. It's different from bread, it's different from electrical outlets, it's different from cars. Like, I think we have been brainwashed by the leaders of AI into thinking that we couldn't have any standards around their products. And
but just to give another, maybe challenging you, bring another example. So, for example, Article 50 of the AI Act brings transparency obligations. And one of the transparency obligations is that if your AI system produces synthetic content, you have to add metadata, right? Provenance signs, it has to be marked as synthetic, AI generated. But they say it has to be effective, robust, interoperable as much as possible. So at this point, to my awareness, there is nothing that is
the minute you say as much as possible that you give away the store, right? So
that's the
on
AI, which is supposedly super strict. So they say not
and
with this
so
wording,
is
but
not
it
strict
says that.
enough, right? So let's take interpretability. As much as possible for an LLM, or as much as possible for any technology. So
State of the
it is
art. So whatever is available. So it's there is an obligation of transparency obligation that is adding provenance signs, but then of course there is a chance for the company to say the way the article, the provision is written, the company can say, but there isn't anything. There is robust, effective, interoperable at this point. So that's it. That's and
that's the point I'm trying to emphasize. I think it is correct. There is no AI technology that is robust, interpretable, and I forgot your third criteria. There just isn't right now. And so one decision society could take would be, okay, fine, come back to us when something was robust, interpretable. What was the third one?
Interoperable, robust, effective. I read so many times. So robust,
robust, effective, and interpretable. So you could say, look, you do one of two things.
Interoperable. Maybe I pronounced wrong. Like interoperable.
Interpretable.
No, that you can transfer from one platform to the other. Interoperable. Sorry, my Brazilian
interoperable. I would have preferred interpretable. Interoperable.
No, interoperable.
Well, I would have put interpretable there, but I didn't get to write the rules. Robust. We'll stick with robust. There are some AI techniques that are robust, like the GPS navigation stuff, but chatbots are not robust, right? They just aren't. Nobody has a robust chatbot. So as a society, we could either say, fine, give us whatever is the best of the garbage that you have available and we'll take it. Or society could say, no, none of this stuff meets what we mean by robust. Come back later, do some research. You guys are all research companies or have big research wings. Figure it out and then come back, and then we will give you access to the market. Like, society could make that decision. It is not, and it is disturbing to me that it is not. But in principle, we could do that. So we don't say for a drug, give us the best thing that you have for Alzheimer's and we'll put it on the market. We say if none of the drugs for Alzheimer's are actually, causing more benefit than harm, then we just won't release one yet. And so we don't really have a drug for Alzheimer's because nothing has met that standard. We have no rule that says you can't have a drug for Alzheimer's. We all want to have a drug for Alzheimer's, but nobody's figured it out yet. There should be no rule that says you can't have general purpose AI. That might be a wonderful thing, but none of the general purpose AI that people have built, to quote general purpose AI, is really that good. It's all jack of all trades, master of none. And there's a few uses for it, but it's not clear that those uses really justify the cost. And the biggest use is probably programming, but we don't have good long-term data about whether the code that is written actually introduces technical debt. So we're not quite sure how much that's a benefit for society. Certainly it helps with brainstorming, but how much benefit is the society that helps with brainstorming relative to all the other risks that we've both talked about today? It's not so clear, and one should have to make that argument. And let me push it a little bit harder, which is OpenAI said that there were greater risks to society from bioweapons from the new model O1, right? And the question should be, should O1 be available to society? Should they have market access? And in the United States right now, the rule is if they want to access the market, they can go ahead. There is no standard there. And you could say, well, how much does it elevate the risk of a major bioweapons attack? Is it 2%? Okay, maybe we let that go because we think the benefits of the O1 model are so great. I mean, I might not, but somebody might, whatever. What if it increased the risk by 5,000%? Should we still just leave that up to Sam Altman? I mean, it's literally just up to Sam Altman. If he wants to release it because it will help him with the next round of fundraising, he can. There's nothing to stop him. Now, in Europe, I don't know all of the rules, but I suspect probably he could there too. I mean, you can tell me, but I don't think that he should, right? I don't think that a technology that increased the bioweapons risk by let's say a major attack of, I don't know, 10,000 people dead, let's say, I don't think you should be able to release a technology that radically increases the probability of those kinds of attacks, or at least not unless you really justify the benefits. So if you could show that it will also save, 10 million people, and here's why, here's how it's going to help with, medical diagnosis, which certainly could be helped by 10 million people because doctors make mistakes and so forth. Unless you could make that demonstration, I'd say, okay, let's not release it yet. Like, show us that the net benefit to society is enough to justify the harm. And if not, we withhold market access. That's what we should be doing.
So just to be pessimistic here, especially as there are so many people from the US in the audience, and for those who hold very high expectations from the EU, the AI Act doesn't do that, and other laws also don't do it. So maybe it doesn't make, so far it's just we have hope. So as someone who's very familiar, so I teach the AI Act. So it's nice to have a risk-based approach. So they have prohibited AI practices, they have high risk, they have transparency risks, so limited risk, all the rest. So obligations for general purpose with systemic risk. But when you zoom in law, I always say in my lessons, my classes, that law is not like philosophy, right? You have an article. So let's imagine you're the lawmaker drafting a provision, a legal provision. It's not like philosophy that a good idea is good enough. You have to write it in a way that will be good, that will have good consequences. So you have to write it in a smart way. So just to give an example, so many examples, but just in terms of loopholes. So if you look at the classification of high risk, is the most important category in the AI Act is probably being classified. So prohibited, I have my criticism. So the provisions in the Article 5 that deals with prohibited AI practices are very narrow. So when the topics are nice, so for example, AI manipulation is prohibited. And then you look at the article, you read, every time I read that paragraph, I say, nobody's going to fit this description. It's so narrow, so specific. It uses so many words and verbs. And in law, whenever you have a choice, right? You can draft a provision that is broad, that many people can fit there, or you can be specific. There are pros and cons for each side. But if you're very specific and you put significant harm, appreciably impairing, all those words, they matter. And they are like a gift for the lawyer of the company. They will say, I don't appreciably impair the person's decision-making ability, or it's not significant harm, it's a minor harm. So all those words, they matter. So we end up with a very, very narrow provision. And I read that and say, wow, everybody that is criticizing the EU, they haven't read the articles. When you read, especially if you have legal training, it's very narrow. And as a lawyer, I can think as a lawyer of the company, so I could handle it. It's badly written. And another example, so perhaps the most important classification in the AI Act is high risk. So many articles, they cover the obligations for AI systems classified as high risk. And on Article 6, third paragraph, you have a major loophole. So even if you're classified as high risk, or even if you're mentioned in one of the titles of Annex 3, you can rely on one of the 4 conditions and say, hey, I am potentially classified as high risk, but I don't pose significant harm to fundamental rights. And when you read the conditions, as a lawyer, you say, wow, it should not have been written that way. So this is my side criticism. You said you wanted to hear from me about the AI Act, and for all those in the US here that had high expectations. And every time I post about anything, a new regulation, some people come and they say, Europe is so bad, they're destroying innovation. This regulation is going to destroy the ecosystem. I always think you probably haven't read. If you had read, you would say it's actually, sometimes I see what the FTC is doing in the US. Sometimes it's very powerful. FTC has, I'm not sure now with the new administration, but so far the FTC has been highly effective against it.
FTC has been under Lena Khan terrific. We'll see what happens. New administration, as you say. Usually on any given call, I think I deliver the worst, most depressing news, but I think you just beat me. I mean, it's very depressing that the nominally best laws around this are so easy to lawyer around. I'm not shocked to hear it, but
let's be hopeful. I like to be optimistic, and I'm not a pessimistic person. So there are 2 hopes. So first, there are future-proofing mechanisms in the AI Act. This is great. So there are 4 main future-proofing mechanisms. So the EU can can try to fix. And actually, for example, they can amend Annex 3. So this is one thing. So there are going to be revisions of the AI Act. Also, the AI Office. They just created this AI Office. It's very interesting, union level governance organ that they are being actually very proactive. So I'm hopeful that they will. They also the AI board, the AI Office. They will issue interpretations and they will kind of fix it. So that can be. But the way now, as a lawyer reading now, it's weak. So everybody that is so there is hype, there is AI hype, and there is AI regulation hype. So wow, the EU is destroying all those people that are saying that they haven't read one by one the articles, because when you read it and you think from a legal
but you know who has read the articles probably are the lawyers for Google, OpenAI, Microsoft. They probably already found those loopholes.
They are happy. They're probably very happy. So and I see law firms that there are so many law firms. I see the marketing from the US. They are saying, you think you're high risk? Maybe not. Come to us. Let's think about it. Maybe you're not high risk. Let's discuss the topic. So it's a great business model. I see.
It's like the doctors that diagnosed the bone spurs in Donald Trump's feet that probably didn't actually exist in order to keep him from having to go to the Vietnam War. It's the same kind of lawyering.
Exactly. So let's move on now. So we spoke about. Let's just want to hear your opinions. There's this big thing in the U.S. especially. Now more in the EU, I see it's having traction. So regulation versus innovation, right? I see Ian LeCun is one big. He raises the flag that EU is over-regulating. And I read that letter, so that I wrote an answer. So they wrote this letter: Europe needs regulatory certainty on AI. And after reading it, I understood that, especially, so Meta, I think Meta was the big leader there. It feels very much like Meta writing that. So they have two main problems. First is GDPR. So basically, it's a big, and then we are moving to your what we should.
Before you go into the specifics, let me just insert one thing. Regulatory certainty is a good thing for companies. Do you know where the greatest point of regulatory uncertainty is now? And it's obviously the United States. We have no idea what the Trump administration is going to do. It's internally consistent. It has, strong personalities that have conflicts of interest. We have no idea what the U.S. regulatory policy will be on AI 2 years from now, whereas we have a very clear idea, not complete, with respect to Europe. And so, the argument that LeCun is giving is actually exactly backwards with respect to the new reality. I just thought that was amusing.
Yeah. So just a quick comment on that and about this thing of innovation, and I want to hear your opinion as well. So from my understanding, that's what concerns Meta and probably other big tech. So two things. First, scraping, right? So in the EU, we have the GDPR. And then to process personal data, and we are scraping from the internet, you must have a lawful ground to process personal data. And if you're scraping, there's going to be some sort of personal data mixed with all the internet data. So they say you have to have lawful ground. So you could ask for consent, but Meta doesn't like consent. They don't ask for advertising. They're not going to ask for training large language models. But most companies now are relying on legitimate interest, and there's a big topic now in Europe. So so you have to pass a 3-part test to be able to comply with legitimate interest, and it's still uncertain. I would say we do not have this balancing test is not well established. So most companies are not doing right. So this is one thing that bothers Meta. So they wrote there that data protection authorities keep spreading. They don't have the same opinion, but Meta could do one thing, which is the same problem they have in the advertising industry. They could ask for consent. So they made that, you heard the story, right? The opt-out form. So if you are in Europe or other parts of the world, you can opt out of AI training. So it's opt-out is not opt-in. So they say regulatory certainty. There is consent would be certainty, perfect certainty. It's really established in the GDPR. They could do that. So they don't do it. So they frame it as uncertainty, but just that because they don't want to do the most certain lawful ground, which is consent. So this is one thing. The second one is the open source part. That open source, even if you're open source, if you're classified as having systemic risk, you have to comply with some obligations. Meta probably is sad about that. They didn't want to comply with extra things with Llama. So this is my view. So when you saw that letter, you've seen this movement towards not just Jan LeCun, but other executives. So what are your thoughts? Why are they pushing for this in Europe? So you think what do they want really? Because there is certainty. The problem is not lack of certainty. We have GDPR, we have AI Act, we have product liability. We will soon have AI liability. So what's the real message? You understand Silicon Valley much more than I. So what's going on here?
I mean, I'm not sure I followed all of the details there. It went by a little bit fast. I think in general, Meta wants to be able to protect its rights to sell your data and to train on your data, and they will do whatever they can in order to protect those two rights. And that means doing sneaky things like opt out rather than opt in, so that as many people as possible sign up for the kinds of things that they're doing. There's some subtlety to the argument there that I think I didn't get, but those are in general their two motivations. And I mean, they're highly dependent on selling your data, and they haven't really made a lot of money from training large language models. They have made a lot of money from being able to target stuff to you based on training other kinds of AI models. And they are under the assumption that they're going to be able to monetize these these generative AI models one way or another, and they want to do everything they can to protect those.
And what's your personal view on this debate on AI regulation versus, I don't think it exists in our privacy community.
Well,
Say.
The general, what's the word that I'm looking for? Like false dichotomy that Silicon Valley has been trying to set up is the idea that regulation and innovation are necessarily inherently incompatible, which is stupid, because sometimes regulation actually inspires innovation. So regulation around emissions inspires electric cars, and regulation around safety in cars inspires seatbelts and airbags and so forth. So sometimes regulation actually inspires the innovation. In fact, I wrote an essay about a year ago about China's regulation, and said that it would be a great irony of history if their crazy regulation that says that all of their generative AI has to be compatible with what the party believes actually inspired advances in AI. So because in the US you can spout whatever misinformation you want without consequence, you can use LLMs, which are not reliable and don't stick to anything, right? Like, I laughed when I saw that Apple has in their system prompt, do not hallucinate, because the system can't comply with it. So China is forcing their developers, for the public use, not the commercial use, but for the consumer facing use, to make their LLMs, or it might be something else, compatible with what the party says. That's actually extremely difficult technically. And I think, as far as I know, they still don't have consumer facing LLMs because people can't meet that standard, because of course people can't guarantee that any given LLM will do any particular thing on any occasion. Emily Bender's stochastic parrot phrase kind of applies. And if you're a stochastic parrot, you might say anything at any given time. And so that may force, would be an example of a regulation possibly inspiring the greatest innovation in AI history. It might inspire someone to build an AI that could actually follow directions, which most, where no generative AI really can do. And so that would be a kind of crazy irony of history. But it for now, that's just a thought experiment, but it shows how completely wrong the notion is that regulation and innovation are incompatible. Or I'll give you just one more example, like airlines, like regulation around safety is part of why people are willing to fly consumer airplanes. So it has inspired any number of innovations around like maintenance, to make sure that the maintenance is done properly. And nobody wants to get on an airline that has even I don't know, 2 crashes a year. Like if some airline had 2 crashes a year because they weren't following the regulations and had lax maintenance or whatever, or lax policies around when people would fly planes, nobody would fly that airline. Like if you have 1 accident in 4 years, people are like, I don't know if I want to be on those guys, right? There were, I guess now there've been 3 accidents on the Boeing Max flight, and people are like, I don't know if I want to take a Boeing Max, even though statistically it's still even the Max, 737 Max, is probably much safer than driving your own car or whatever. But because of the dynamics of how these things are reported and so forth, no airline can afford, in fact, to violate these safety regulations. It's extremely rare that any of them do. And so innovation around safety has been inspired by regulation. This dichotomy is just one of the most absurd things I've ever heard, but it is part of mid 21st century style to say absurd claims, to promote them on the internet, and eventually people believe them. And so that's where we are.
Just that you brought regulation, and I saw in your book that you're really interested in this topic. But it actually, from a legal perspective, that's the challenge of regulation, because you mentioned aviation. We can think about cigarettes right now. Before cigarettes were incentivized, doctors said it's actually great for stress, great for children, teachers smoking, and then now we have the packaging, so all this and taxes and so on. But then we have sugar, right? Sugar is basically almost unregulated. We have just the labeling. Sometimes it is red, the amount of sugar. That's the big challenge, but it's not an easy. I love the debate, and as someone that went to law school, so I love that. But then what's the analogy? So large language models, are they like the cigarette, like heroin, like sugar, like the plane? That's where the fight will be, right?
They're like heroin. They're like heroin in the sense that people got addicted to them despite the downsides. I'll go with that.
Okay, that's a hard one, Gary. Okay, so maybe we should have no LLMs. It should be only in the dark markets there.
No, I mean, I wouldn't go that far, but I mean, they do have an addictive property, and I think people do underestimate the downsides, and they ignore downsides like the cost of the environment and so forth. It's not clear to me that there's a overall net benefit to society of LLMs, but most people aren't going to want to give them up. I mean, heroin has its own set of problems. LLMs, it's a different set of problems, right? Like the cost to democracy of living in an environment where nobody trusts anything is pretty high. It's hard to put a number on it. It's not the same as, number of deaths per year caused by cigarettes, which you can try to estimate. But, we have turned a corner in terms of society's trust, and LLMs are contributing to that. They're not the only factor. I think social media has so far been a larger factor, but LLMs, because they can automate the generation of misinformation, are definitely undermining trust in society. And that's a cost. It's an immense cost that's hard to, quantify, but it's a serious cost for society. And then there are other costs that are also a little bit invisible because people don't like to report them. So cyber attacks are clearly also being escalated by LLMs that can participate in that chain in a number of different ways, tricking people out of passwords, and also finding zero-day vulnerabilities and so forth and so forth. The companies that get attacked by cybercrime don't like to report it because it hurts their brand that they were attacked. And so we don't have accurate numbers. But when I've talked informally to chief information officers and so forth, they all say that, the costs of cybercrime are going up, and probability or the, regularity of it's going up and so forth. So there are all these hidden costs. It's in some ways, it's like when different manufacturers used to dump chemicals in the water, and so nobody noticed it for a while. There were big costs, but they're sort of behind the scenes. So there's a lot of behind the scenes costs of LLMs that I think actually are quite serious.
And before we finish, I want to talk about the topics that what we should insist on. I want us, well, have two, I hope you can stay 5 more minutes, Gary. Then I wanted to share with the audience the topics that you think we should insist on. And I wanted your final message to the audience. So you finish, you're actually very optimistic in your book. I like the way you finish. So you empower people. So what you can do, and I think it's nice to be optimistic and think we can do something. So it's better for our mental sanity. So this is what Gary says in his book. So what we should insist on in terms of important rights, and I want to hear your opinion. So we do not have a lot of time, so very quick. I just want to hear your opinion on data rights. So I'll read everything, and we are quickly discussing copyright. So data rights, which is related to copyright, privacy, transparency, and transparency he breaks down into 4 pieces. So data set transparency, algorithmic transparency, provenance science, environment and labor, corporate risks, liability, AI literacy, independent oversight in layers, incentivizing good AI, agile governance and AI agency, international AI governance, and research into genuinely trustworthy AI. So this is, I invite you to get Gary's book and read of everything that he writes in all very interesting. So I would say this is a really great overview of what's going on now. So if you need a book to understand what's going on and what we should insist on, and the most important also policy related parts or ethical parts and legal parts, Gary's book is excellent. And on data rights specifically, so you've been following AI copyright laws lawsuits, right? There was just one recently in India, a new one, so they keep coming. And from book authors, from creators, from news media companies, so from different sources. So basically everyone that owns copyright is suing AI companies. What are your thoughts? What's the way out? So we have been, now the newest lawsuits, they have been coming up with ideas. So for news media companies, we see more and more licensing, right? They want to have licensing deals. It looks like news companies, they are in bad financial situations, so licensing deals would be great for them. But for creators and book writers, it would be different. So what are your thoughts? What would be the best way out for copyright issues?
I mean, I think licensing is the answer here.
No, the other
And
idea, I forgot. Sorry, I forgot to mention. So, licensing and being compensated by output. So every time the output mentions your work. So those are the main.
yeah, I mean, the problem there is technical, right? So, like I mentioned in the book, some work I did with Read South, and where uh, we gave prompts to systems like Midjourney and OpenAI's DALL-E, things like Italian plumber, and the system would come back and give you the Mario character from Nintendo. And this is an obvious copyright violation. But what's interesting is the systems can't actually do attribution. They can't say, I got this from Mario. And so this is a part of the problem with the licensing is the current technology that we're using, which is LLMs and technologies like Stable Diffusion. What they do is they explode the information that they've seen into billions or trillions of little bits of information, and then they reconstruct those billions or trillions of bits of, or whatever it is, bits of information into statistically probable outcomes. That gives you your hallucinations, because statistically probable is defined in terms of co-occurrence of words and stuff like that. And it also leads to occasional plagiarism. Doesn't mean that you get plagiarism every time, but the plagiarist thing is the most statistically probable output. So the most statistically probable output for Italian plumber is Mario. But along the way of breaking that up into the little bits of information, the systems actually lose track of which information is which, because of the ways in which they basically do superposition, I guess would be one term for it, of these little bits of information. And so the right licensing deals should really actually do attribution on a per output basis. So this particular output draws from, this character and this character, or these lines of text or whatever, and there should be payment for that. Current technology does not support that. There may be some future technology that does. And I think in some ways the companies would actually be happy with that. Like if they had a clear answer that everybody could kind of say, yeah, that's fair, that would be better for them than just sort of getting sued left and right and being hated and so forth. And then they could just mark it off as a cost of business. But again, because of technical inadequacies of this technology, we can't actually do that yet. So what people are instead doing is they're licensing the inputs rather than the outputs of the system. So I use so many documents and we'll charge you X dollars. I do think some form of licensing is the answer in the end. I mean, what some of the companies are trying to do is just theft. They just want to say, well, we can't build our models unless we steal it. And that's not true. They can pay for it. They can license it. And they have lots of money. And we should insist that they do it. The historical parallel here is Napster, right? For a minute, Napster was stealing music left and right. And you had people saying, well, information wants to be free. We shouldn't have to pay for this. And the court said, no, we have copyright laws and you will pay for it. And we sorted it out. Now we have streaming and people pay a monthly fee and it's all fine. And we will wind up with something similar. I think there's every reason in the world to compensate the artists and writers and so forth who are being ripped off. But that's actually one of the easier questions. Harder questions are like, how do you handle defamation? How do you handle bias? And especially like, what do we do about misinformation? It's a really complicated question. Here, with respect to the creators, we should pay them. Let's go figure it out.
Thank you, Yari. And now we are over our time. So what's your final message, an optimistic message? Let's see, there are people here that want to do something. They want to help make sure that AI will work for us. So what's your message, your optimistic, positive, happy message? I'm kidding, it doesn't need to be happy. So what's your message to the audience that wants to do something about it?
I will couch it as a happy message. We could, as a society, if we chose to, organize and boycott generative AI until it worked better, until it stopped stealing, stopped polluting the environment, stopped discrimination against people who aren't white males, stop hallucinating, stop defaming people, or reduce those to some more reasonable level than they do now. We could organize a society. It doesn't often happen, but there are moments in history where a lot of people have organized and fought something that was unfair. Gandhi's salt marches, the Nestle formula boycott, and so forth. We could say, as a society, even though all the money and all the power is with the government and the tech oligarchs — I can't believe we didn't use that phrase today because that is driving a lot of this. We could say no to the tech oligarchs because what matters to them is money. And the way that they get money is they show these statistics that show rising users. That's how they justify the huge venture capital valuations, as they say their users are going up. So if we all sat around, read my book, realized how awful things are going to get if we don't take action, we could together work together, boycott this stuff for a year or two and get them to make something better and more fair and so forth. The world would be a better place. So that's the optimistic thought.
Thank you very much, Gary. Thank you so much for coming. And where people can find you? So now you're not on Twitter, or still on Twitter? What's the final
I am
answer?
hoping not to return to Twitter, except to occasionally post notes saying I'm having a great time in Blue Sky. You can find me there. So you can find me at Blue Sky, and you can find me at Substack, I guess, and LinkedIn. Those are the three places that I am most often. I also trying Threads and Mastodon and so forth, but Blue Sky, Substack, and LinkedIn are the best places to find me.
Thank you so much, Gary. It was such an excellent session. I think the audience. So you see, I don't know if you could read what they were writing. So all the time.
No, I couldn't see it at last, but I could tell it was a wonderful interview because I had a really good time. So thanks a lot. It was a
pleasure. Thank you so much, Gary. Thank you to the audience for being always so nice and active and participating and making everyone feel part of it. And if you want to stay informed, so don't forget to subscribe to my newsletter. So December, we are meeting again for the next live talk. And if you want to join the December training, register. So there are a few spots left. So thank you very much. Thank you, Gary. Thank you, everyone. And I see you in December. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.